Welcome, and thanks for joining today's webinar, Ignatian STEM, What Difference Can a Jesuit Education Make? I'm Jim McCartan of Fordham University's Theology Department. I'm the chair of the National Seminar on Jesuit Higher Education, which publishes Conversations on Jesuit Higher Education, the sponsor of today's webinar. And it's my pleasure to have you all here today, and especially to welcome our panelists. Before we begin, I want to invite audience members to share your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen at any time. Later on in the discussion, panelists will have a chance to respond. It's my pleasure now to introduce our moderator, Chris Brooks. Chris is a professor of computer science and engineering at the University of San Francisco, where he previously served as associate dean and led the construction of the Lo Chavo Center for Science and Innovation, as well as the development of USF's engineering program. Chris's research interests include the ways in which human and artificial agents learn, as well as the issues at the nexus of social justice and computing, about which perhaps he'll say something. Chris, thanks for moderating today, and I'll hand things off to you.
Thanks, Jim. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I want to thank everybody on the webinar for taking the time to be with us today. This is just such an important issue, I think, for all of us to discuss. We're really at a tipping point, I think, in human history, where on one hand, we have access to incredible science and technology that's changing our world every day. And on the other hand, we have problems that are, really facing human existence, whether we're talking about things like the pandemic or AI and machine learning and the influences it might have. And of course, all this happens under the umbrella of the climate crisis, which is ongoing. And so I'm hoping today that we can take a little bit of time as a group to talk about how Jesuit education, in particular, the Ignatian approach to teaching science and technology, can really help to shape our world for the better and have some positive impacts. So I want to start by introducing our panelists, and they're each going to give a short talk or short presentation about their perspective on this. And then we'll get to the fun stuff, which is where we get everybody to talk to each other as well. So let me go ahead and briefly introduce the panelists, and then I will hand the mic over to them. So our first panelist is Aaron Van Dyke. Aaron is an associate professor in the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry at Fairfield University. Since joining the Fairfield faculty, Aaron has been recognized for his exceptional teaching and mentoring, and his research focuses on the immodulatory effect of eggs in the human diet. Aaron has also published on the value of using personal devices as digital laboratory notebooks. Aaron, thank you for being here. Our second panelist is Margaret Frege. Margaret is a professor of mathematics at College of the Holy Cross. Margaret is a specialist in arithmetic geometry, and over the past 25 years, she has served in a variety of leadership roles at Holy Cross. Most recently, in 2002, she completed 8 years of service, first as Vice President for Academic Affairs and Dean of the College, and then later as Provost and Dean of the College. Margaret, it's a great pleasure to have you here with us. Our third panelist is Nancy Tuckman. Nancy is the founding dean of Loyola University Chicago's School of Environmental Sustainability. This is the first such school of its kind at a Jesuit institution in the U.S. Nancy is both a master teacher and a research fellow at Loyola, and her research focuses on human impacts on aquatic ecosystem structure and function. As dean, Nancy manages 7 interdisciplinary undergraduate programs and a master's program in environmental science and sustainability. Nancy, it's a real pleasure to have you with us today. And our final panelist is Chris Rapella. Chris is the Opus Dean of the Opus College of Engineering at Marquette University. Chris's research expertise is in biosignal processing and medical imaging for diagnostic medical devices. She's also an award-winning teacher and the founder of Excellence in Leadership, an interdisciplinary program that cultivates innovative student leaders by inviting them into deeper engagement with Jesuit values. So as you can see, we've got 4 really impressive, super smart people here from all across the STEM disciplines to provide their different perspectives, I think both as administrators and as faculty. So I'm really excited to get the conversation going here. I'm going to start with Aaron. And Aaron, can you tell us a little bit about your take on this topic?
Yeah, Chris, thanks so much. And thanks to Conversations for the opportunity to be here today. As I was thinking about this, one kind of Jesuit phrase came to mind, and that was our way of proceeding. And I think that STEM gives us a very unique way of proceeding, the scientific method in particular. So it advances our knowledge of the material world, and it relies on our ability to quantify things in the world. But I've also had the opportunity this semester to team teach a course with one of my colleagues, Professor Beth Bouquet in the English department. And it's a class on literacies of illness and disease. And we read this really fascinating short story by Eula Biss called The Pain Scale. And we, and I think the students quickly realized there are many human processes that we would like to think we can quantify, and pain being one of them. But it turns out they're not so easily quantifiable. Many of us have probably gone into a doctor's office and been asked to rate our pain on a scale from 0 to 10. And when the author, Eula, was reflecting on this, she said, I tried to imagine what the most horrific pain would be like, a 10, and then imagine what my pain was as a percentage of that. And when she was recounting to her dad, who himself was a physician, this experience, she said, well, I came up with a 3. And he said, a 3? That's nothing. That's a take 2 aspirin and go home kind of pain. But for her, a person who was living with chronic pain, that for her was a very serious number. So it got me thinking about the ways in which being at a liberal arts institution, right, having the privilege to teach STEM and mentor students in STEM at a liberal arts institution, we're introduced to another way of proceeding. So the liberal arts, right, is rooted in humanistic inquiry. And instead of asking the question, how do we advance our knowledge of the measurable world? It asks instead, what does it mean to be a human being fully alive? Right? What does it mean to be a human being fully alive? And so I'm excited for some of my other panelists to maybe pick up this idea. Well, what's the relationship between these two ways of proceeding? Engaging the measurable world, but then what does it mean to be a human being fully alive in this world? And I don't have all the answers to that, but I might suggest that we're doing this in a Catholic environment, right? So Catholic and Jesuit, 2 very rich words, but also 2 very unique words. And one other piece that I might toss out in my kind of opening introductory remarks is that the Catholic intellectual tradition offers to us this wonderful insight that everything around us has an opportunity to help us discover truth about our existence. And that tradition would call, that principle is called sacramentality. And so I wonder, in what ways can we see our work as scientists? Can my colleague, Professor Bouquet, see her work as a literary scholar? And our students see their work in their various and unique disciplines as coming to understand truth, but also to see themselves as human beings who are fully alive.
Thanks, Aaron. That was really helpful. And I love the story about being able to assign a number to pain, because I think it calls out that we as scientists often think things are measurable when really, just because we put a number on it doesn't make it a measurable quantity, right? It's still based on some sort of human subjective interpretation. I love that you pulled that out and really kind of called us out that just because we say something objective, it does not mean that it's truly objective. I want to invite Margaret to join the conversation now. Margaret, can you please jump in?
Sure, happy to. Thanks, Aaron. That was really helpful, and actually meshes pretty well with some of the things that I thought I would try to draw out in this conversation. When I think about the mission of Jesuit education, I tend to focus on the roots in two different areas, right? So first, the intellectual tradition, right, which is, of course, both the tradition of the liberal arts and the Catholic intellectual tradition that Aaron was referring to. And second, in Ignatian spirituality. And in some ways, I think about those as the head and the heart of Jesuit education, right? And ideally, we find ways to put those in dialogue with one another. So I was asked to think about, right, what the particular opportunities and challenges are that STEM faculty might face, right, in connecting their intellectual interests to Jesuit education. But what I want to suggest is that scientists, right, as scholars and teachers, actually have an opportunity to both draw from and make visible the head and the heart, I think. And maybe the head is the more obvious part of the intellectual tradition, right, for us, that it may be the place we feel more comfortable. There's a lot to talk about there, but the thing I want to call attention to is the opportunity for STEM to develop a capacity for wonder. In ourselves and in our students, frankly. The recent Conversations magazine piece by Philip Metris titled "Let Us Be Attentive: How Wondering Leads to Justice Seeking" opens with this paragraph, which I absolutely love. "When my children reached the age of 3, something amazing happened. The world opened up to them in all of its mystery. Everything, quite literally everything, induced a series of questions. Why? I marveled at them as they plumbed the depths of the known universe, 3 or 4 whys in a row, and were at the heart of the mystery of being alive, the wonder and the mystery of creation and the trouble of the world." I think that's what STEM faculty do, right? They try to call us back to being 3 and 4, right? And asking the question, why? The questions at the root of STEM for me are always how and why. Those are also the questions at the root of wonder. And I think they're the questions at the root of liberal arts education. And I think that, they're from the position of the Catholic intellectual tradition, again, this is echoing something Aaron said, right? We posit that God is incarnate, actively working in the world, right? And so as we're asking those questions of how and why, right, we're searching, right, to better understand that creative action, right? What it's finding God in all things, right? To use the Jesuit language. And when I think about the heart, I guess what I will call attention to is the capacity to fall in love. So Michael Himes was a theologian at Boston College, recently deceased. And one of the things he suggested in many of his talks, right, is that everything that exists has been loved into existence by God, right? It's love all the way down, he says. It's the foundation of spiritual exercises, in fact. And one of my many wishes for our students while they're with us is that they will have the experience of being loved and the experience of falling in love, right? With something, with an idea, with a creative expression, with something. And in many ways, I think STEM faculty have some really unique opportunities for this. The STEM faculty I know have fallen in love with what they're studying. Whether it's a cave beetle or a physical structure, right? This is the upside of being a nerd, right? And when you hear them speak about their work, I think they make visible this idea of engaging the world with love. And the STEM faculty I know spend countless hours mentoring students in their labs, challenging them, supporting them, often drawing out more than the students ever thought they could possibly do. And this, I think, is most certainly an experience of being loved, though we probably don't name it that way. For challenges, I'll name 2. There are more. I think we can be constrained by the structures of our disciplines and the structures of academia. And this speaks to that team talk course that Aaron was talking about, right? There are other questions that we know as STEM faculty should be asked, but we're not exactly sure we should ask them, right? Not just how and why, but perhaps for whom, right? And not just can we, but should we? It's interesting to me that I've seen faculty engage those questions actually more frequently when they teach non-science students than when they teach science students, right? Which is sort of backwards for me, but I understand it. And secondly, I think there's a challenge that applies to all of Jesuit higher education. If we're going to connect our lives, no matter what our discipline is with Jesuit mission, we need a shared understanding and a shared language around mission and how we do this work together. I think it's difficult, increasingly difficult, to find the language to communicate who we are and what we do to both internal and external audiences. For example, we understand what we're doing to be about the common good, right? The questions we're thinking about to be about, what do we need, right? While the external world is even more fixated on individual gain, right? Will my kid get a job when they finish this? And this is language that's going to require a dialogue across boundaries, right? It does require that course that's team taught between the sciences and the humanities, right? And a dialogue across racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic boundaries, which requires time and presence together. So that is both the opportunity and the challenge, I think, for us, right? In any event, those are a few thoughts, and I certainly look forward to continuing the conversation with folks.
Thank you, Margaret. There's so much great stuff in there for me to think about. In particular, I think you're right on that we need to learn how to talk better to one another. And it's increasingly challenging as our disciplines get more specialized. As a scientist, I know it's very easy to dive into the details and get down in the weeds and forget to tell my students about the wonder and amazing things and why it is that I fell in love with this in the first place. And so I think being intentional about how we describe why we do what we do to our students is really critical. And I agree with you that working with our humanist colleagues can kind of force us out of our shells to answer those questions a little more carefully. I want to invite Nancy to join the conversation now and share her perspective on all this.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Erin and Margaret. That was really a great setup for what I want to talk about, because I think what's special about being a scientist at a Jesuit university is that, you sort of get to teach students about the wonder of science and how it all works. I'm an ecologist, and so I really love to focus on nature and the amazing complexities and intricacies that happen between organisms and the environment. And I think, to Erin's point, the scientific method being kind of a particular way of proceeding or a way of knowing, I draw a lot of similarities between Teilhard de Chardin and his methodologies with the scientific method. It just kind of resonates with me. But I think that also the Ignatian pedagogy is sort of the see or observe, the judge, or maybe evaluating, and then the reflection, and then the action. What really inspires me is the call to action that the Jesuits not only, sort of say we do this, but it's like, we need to do more. We can't just keep learning. We have to do something about what we know and the tools that we're gaining. And so I want to share with you my experience of 35 years at Loyola University, Chicago. At Loyola University, we've been working on the environmental crisis for 21 years, and it's really a very interdisciplinary approach, but STEM is at the center of it, because nature is really, it's a wonder, it's a creation, but there are mechanisms in nature that you can explain and understand through science. And so if STEM is at the center, but then you require the humanities and the social sciences and even, business and law to be a part of it, it becomes a very interdisciplinary issue, and certainly requires all these different disciplines to address the issue. So I see this issue as something that all of our Jesuit universities are being called into action from the top leadership, from Pope Francis. Of course, everybody's familiar with Laudato Si, but the very recent apostolic exhortation, Laudato Diem, is very important for us to look at. He's angry. He's disappointed with us for being, laggards. We're not doing enough. We're not moving quickly enough. And we are frankly using up resources for future generations, but we're calling it progress for our generation. And so it's not just the Pope calling us into action, but it's the Society of Jesus through their own kind of strategic plan that outlines these four universal apostolic preferences. And I would say all four of them align with the environmental crisis. Certainly, walking with the excluded is very central because environmental crisis really disproportionately impacts the poor. And journeying with the youth and helping them find a hope-filled future, it isn't a hope-filled future the way that we're really exploiting our environment. So that's an inspiration to have the leaders of our organization giving us kind of a mandate, but also a destiny on where, or a destination on where we need to be going with this work. If you look at what's on the minds of the young people that are coming into our colleges and universities, in 2020, Forbes and Amnesty International did an international survey of Generation Z, and they asked the question, what are the most important issues that are facing the world and those that are facing your country? And you can see here that the top issue is climate change. And number 2 is pollution. Number 3 is terrorism. And number 4 is loss of natural resources. So of the top 4, 3 of those issues are about the environmental crisis. It's really on top of mind, and it is something that we need to tend to help these students, to give them a hope-filled future. I want to give you Loyola University Chicago as a case study because it's so exciting for me to see how so many more universities, not just in the AJCU, but across the International Association of Jesuit Universities, some 200 universities are really activating around Pope Francis's Laudato Si action plan. And we've been at this for a long time. For 21 years, we've been working on this at our university. And so I think we can kind of use this as a model that works pretty well. And I'll say that we've always taken this kind of two-pronged approach. So we've had two areas of work working parallel to one another over this period of time. And one of them is reducing our own campus environmental footprint by, working on the efficacy and the efficiency of our buildings and all of our operational systems, looking at our consumption of energy, water, our production of waste and production of greenhouse gases, et cetera. And then, of course, because we are institutes of higher education and education is the wheelhouse of the organization, that's the second prong of the two-prong approach. So as I mentioned, we've been working on greening our campus and building curricula for 21 years, and we've been able to meet many of the goals that we've set out for ourselves, and we continue to set higher and higher goals. We meet carbon neutralization by January 2025, when the power purchase agreement that we signed with a local solar plant will flip the switch and turn on their system. But we're already building our next climate action plan to be decarbonized. So we're carbon neutral by 2025. What that means is that 100% of our electricity is sourced by renewables, but we still burn natural gas in many of our hot water heaters and furnaces around the campus. So we're currently, paying for carbon offsets to be a carbon neutral campus, but we're still emitting greenhouse gases. So we need to decarbonize and get off of fossil fuels altogether. That's a hugely ambitious and very expensive goal. But what I love about this place is that we just keep pushing ourselves forward. And of course, you get all sorts of accolades for this. We've been ranked in the top 5% of green campuses since the whole green campus rankings began in 2010. And we've won a lot of awards and recognitions. But I think one of the most cool things to see is that when we survey our incoming freshmen, 54.4% of them tell us that the reason why they came to Loyola is because we are committed to the environment. And, that's, we've got about 2,800 incoming freshmen every year. And so that's a big batch of students that really cares about the fact that we are committed to the environment. I think what I'm starting to see more and more universities talking about is getting an environmental literacy course into the university core curriculum. And we did this back in 2012. And in fact, there are 2 science core requirements by every student across the university. Everybody has to have a certain degree of science literacy, and we were able to get the scientific basis of environmental issues, climate change, the loss of biodiversity, food and water insecurity, natural resources. Those are the 5 topics that are addressed in this ENVS 101 course. And students across the university have to take this so that we know that our students, when they graduate, they have some degree of literacy about the drivers of climate change and loss of biodiversity, et cetera. And they're not going through 4 years and never hearing about these things, which I think is an atrocity when that can happen. I think it was Pedro Arrupe who said that universities are important agents of social change. And if we want to make social change, we really have to commit to these kinds of social issues that are directly impacting the poor and the youth. And so I think of everything that we do in our new School of Environmental Sustainability, this is probably the most impactful and maybe most important contribution that we have to the curriculum. I'm going to jump over this. This just kind of shows you how we built the School of Environmental Sustainability, which was launched in the year 2020. We started as a little department of environmental studies that was in the College of Arts and Sciences, and then we became an Institute of Environmental Sustainability in the year 2013. And at that point, we started getting more students, and you can see how we've diversified our curricula. And we're offering many more majors and minors in the curricula, but we're also growing. And we're really the only school at Loyola Chicago right now that's continuing to grow in our enrollments. Here you can just see kind of a layout of the different programs that we're offering under the umbrella of the School of Environmental Sustainability. And those that I highlighted in yellow demonstrate collaborations across 5 different schools. So we've really been able to get, environmental issues into the curriculum across many schools in kind of a big way, in a programmatic way. And these are majors and master's programs and certificates. And then I just want to say one final thing is that our students are getting employed. And it's a pretty high rate of employment. Some of them go off to graduate school, but of those that are in the job market, there are so many different regions in our economy where these students can be employed, and they're change agents. They're affecting change to help their organizations be more environmentally sustainable. So I think this work, for me, it's a way of really showing that Jesuit universities are trying to prioritize some of the world's issues. I see this as a STEM problem, but it really requires the whole university because it's such a complex social problem that, we need everybody on deck. And so I just am excited about how the Jesuits are leading in this. And I think it's a very important STEM leadership role. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Nancy. And so first off, thank you to you for all your leadership in the AJCU over these years. I think you and Loyola University have been a great leader, and I think you've done a great job of setting an example of how not to take half measures, right? As you said, it's been hard, but you've not given up and not accepted a weaker solution right away just to get a payoff, but you've instead really set a great example for all of us. So thank you so much for that. And I'm particularly grateful that you mentioned Pedro Arrupe and the idea that universities are agents of social change. I think that is a particularly Ignatian idea, and one that we don't always hear about in the mainstream STEM world or even in mainstream academia. I often point out to people that the words above Harvard's library are about knowledge and advancement of knowledge, not about changing the world. That to me feels very Jesuit, and I think we'll come back to that in the Q&A. I want to give Chris Rapella a chance to come join the conversation as well. Chris, thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Thank you for having me, and thank you, Erin and Margaret and Nancy, for your words. It's really great to that we share some common vocabulary and mission in the way we think about the world and the students we're preparing. So it's just wonderful to sit here and listen to this. And I come from a background of healthcare technologies, and I think a lot about how the ethical questions in healthcare are getting more and more complex, and the science between some of the biological and health sciences that we're doing, and how tough some of the questions can be in terms of that line between good and bad. So it's a pleasure to be here. I think as we think about our Jesuit sort of pursuits and priorities, I really think of 4 elements. One is truth, justice, leadership and service of others, and finding God in all things. And I have to just ask myself, how can these priorities be in opposition to science when I think about, particularly science is really for the benefit of humanity and our world. And so I think about science is the search for truth, and science only happens when there is vigorous debate, challenge, and questioning. Challenges about hypotheses, experimental design, value and quality of data, summary of data, and conclusions drawn. And I think I can't help but think about the whole COVID crisis and how that was managed. And one might argue that science wasn't actually allowed to happen, as debate and argument were often shut down by government, industries, hospitals, and more. Challenge was not allowed and questioning was not allowed if it was counter to either party line or some party line. And so I would argue that science can't happen when freedom to question, challenge the status quo, see things differently is not allowed to happen. And I would argue that Jesuit education is actually all about discovery, debate, challenge, the willingness to see things differently through curiosity, creativity, an innovative mindset, and a willingness to be immersed in uncomfortable, unfamiliar context. In fact, St. Ignatius and the Jesuits, who went out in the world with nothing on their back, were all about the uncomfortable and the willingness to meet people where they were at and find truth in an effort to create a better world. As I think about justice is often what drives science. I think Nancy and Margaret and Erin all spoke to this, and that we often do science in finding justice for wanting a better world for all, better health, shelter, food, energy, water, communication for all, regardless of physical location, social class, economic status. Science is often used to address many of these issues, ultimately leading to new strategies and technologies. And in seeking justice, we often steer science to do good rather than harm. I often tell my engineering students that every technology that does good also does harm. And what I'm hoping is that our graduates of Jesuit institutions have the courage to raise their voice, stand up, and question things. And just because we can do it doesn't mean we should do it. And they're willing to stand up when they see ethical compromise and moral challenges. And this really comes down to what I call leadership. Good science requires good leadership. And what Jesuit education offers is a different kind of leaders, truly servant leaders, even in our STEM fields. Servant leaders working to do good in the world. And we know that science is not done in a vacuum, and that whether we like it or not, science is not always objective. And there is definitely evil in our science world, oftentimes driven by things like financial gains, the need to publish, promotion and tenure challenges, political issues, and just corruption in general, often cloud our scientific world. And I think it's really been amplified in the last few years if we've seen these kinds of behaviors. And what I think Jesuit education do is kind of bring us to back what science is supposed to be, creating a more objective way of doing things, an objective way of looking at things than maybe what we're often seeing today. So Jesuit education is all about asking the hard questions. I hope taking the evil out of science, because there's just as we have, we've seen the mad, crazy, evil scientist. It does exist in many different forms. And I think it's our job to challenge that. And the reality is that often in challenging science, we often find better alternative ways to do the science, whether we think about stem cell research, use of animals in research, using diverse populations in IRB protocols, things that we maybe hadn't done in the past, but because we've challenged it now through different lenses, we're actually doing better, particularly in healthcare, because we've changed the way we think about healthcare research and compared to what was done many decades ago. I also think about, the fact of why did it take a Hollywood movie like Hidden Figures to know that women of color did the hard math when it came to space exploration? It blows my mind that it took that long for that to come out. And so I hope in Jesuit education, science is really driven by the notion of finding God in all things, and that we're doing science for the good of humanity. And that in doing so, we really continually define, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be a more loving world? And I think one's better prepped for this than our Jesuit educated graduates.
Thanks, Chris. I particularly appreciate you reminding us that technology is not neutral, and it set me up nicely for my next question here. But you're absolutely right. You know, technology is a device, and it can be applied to good or evil ends depending on how we use it. Let me quickly remind our attendees here: if you have questions for our panelists, please put them in the Q&A, and the many elves behind the scenes here will help me process them, and then we'll get them out to our panelists. So please put your questions in the Q&A if you've got anything you are wanting to know about from our panelists. But I want to pick up on something, Chris, that you said, and also that Nancy got into before, which is this, the Pope has been pretty clear, both in Laudato Si and then in Laudate Deum, about this idea that technology is not neutral, and that, in fact, we as a society need to make some better choices about it. So let me read you a quick quote, and then I'm going to ask whichever of you would like to respond to give me your take on it. Just find it here quick. So this is from Laudato Si. And Pope Francis says, "We have to accept that technological products are not neutral, for they create a framework which ends up conditioning lifestyles and shaping social possibilities along the lines dictated by the interests of certain powerful groups. Decisions which may seem purely instrumental are in reality decisions about the kind of society that we want to build." So if we think that's true, and we think that, as scientists, we need to select the problems that we work on, and that, so how do we do that in this Ignatian framework? How do we not just choose things that are fun or interesting or might advance knowledge, but that really will, in particular, do the Jesuit work of having the preferential option for the poor and for advancing human justice? And with that complicated question, I'm just going to let whoever wants to answer jump in.
Well, I'll jump in a little bit. I do not have an answer. That's a really good, tough question that we talk about all the time. But I think, at least on our campuses, I'm a real advocate for how do we think about, combining courses where we're bringing in professors from engineering and history and sociology, and to really talk about this concept that technology often does to determine how we behave as a society, the way we behave on a day-to-day basis, where we put our resources, where we put our money, where we spend our money, how we communicate and relate to other people. That's particularly come out, the fact that we're on Zoom now, we're doing so much relational, online kind of thing, because of we have the technology to do it. And now people don't even want to go back to work. They want to sit in their homes, and they don't want to necessarily be in the physical presence like they were in the past. And so some of that's very disturbing, actually. And so, Chris, I'm not sure how we tackle this, except again to have these conversations and to force these conversations. I also think, we need to have a voice when it comes to places like the National Institutes of Health and National Science Foundation and Department of Energy, and make sure we are getting on the Hill, we are advocating for things, and I often think the best thing we can do is teach our students how to write a letter to your congressperson. How do you voice your stuff in public forums where it matters? Because no one else is going to do it for us. And so how do you use your influence there? And even just your influence in your local communities, you have to get involved. You have to vote. You can't sit on the side and say, I'm just going to work on my cubicle and I'm going to do my software and I'm not going to care about it, because that's not okay anymore. At least it's not okay for our graduates. You actually do have to get out there and care about what's happening in the political environment, the economic environment, where companies are investing, and be a voice. Nancy, I'll give it to you. Or Margaret, or Aaron.
I'll call on you, Nancy, and then Margaret next.
I can just say that I resent how technology has shaped my world from being a field ecologist, where I used to spend so much time in the water with waders on, with a bunch of students behind me, looking at bugs, identifying plants, really learning something about the world that we live in. And now I spend 90% of my time sitting in a chair looking at my computer, and everything is very transactional. It is incredibly inefficient. And we were all sold on, how the magic computer was going to, give us so much free time that we would be able to just work a few days a week and get as much work done and it's really just put us on this never ending, ever speeding up treadmill. And I resent that nobody ever asked, do we want this? I feel the same thing about cars that, don't have drivers. And maybe I'm old fashioned, but I feel this way about AI. I'm afraid of it. I feel like it can be weaponized so easily and it's already being used to do bad, like I think it's hard for teachers to know if their students have done their work or if they're just using ChatGPT to do the writing for them. So it's making our lives, it's forcing us to deal with stuff that we never asked to have in the first place. It's just sort of, I think Pope Francis has it right. I think he's done this social analysis and he sees how it impacts. It's made some people multi-billionaires and some companies have really rich employees, but the rest of us have to live in this world. And so I feel like there needs to be a better social and ethical analysis on these kinds of things before the industry just goes ahead and starts building them. There just isn't that kind of oversight. There's not an ethical oversight body that has to approve these kinds of things.
I think you're right on there that we don't have any sort of guardrails, right? It's whatever makes it to market first is what we do. And as the AI guy in the room, I'll say I feel like that really gives us an obligation as educators to set the agenda a little bit differently and not just make it be about short-term profit and where's that little niche that you can take your company public and get rich, but instead, what's the real problems that can be solved? I'm an optimist enough to say that there's some good things that AI could do too, apart from helping kids plagiarize. I think there's a lot of value to it, but I think it's incumbent on us to state that value and not leave it to the Elon Musks of the world to figure it out.
And yeah, now more than ever. I mean, you think about it, great example, the ChatGPT. And I first hear about it and I think, great, we're just creating one opportunity for people not to critically think for themselves, know how to do research themselves and how to dig in. So I think we need to be much more intentional about those things. Okay, you're going to use it, but how do we not let them sort of miss out on this whole critical thinking piece and how to really dig into something? And Nancy, you touched on something too, which is we're all stockholders in some way. If we've got a retirement plan, wherever it may be, how we're investing in those companies. And we're ultimately responsible oftentimes for company behaviors too, because they tend to respond on a short term to stockholders and what they want. And, we ultimately have to look back on ourselves and where we're putting our own investments.
I want to bring Margaret and Aaron into the conversation. I have a little bit different question here, which is about how we make sure that all of our students have this baseline level of scientific literacy. Nancy, you got to this too, that, our world is so complex. And I don't know about you guys, but what I've noticed is specifically the smarter student, or not, I'm going to say smarter, the students who got some background in high school in science are the ones who don't take it in college unless they're a science major, right? So how do we get past this gulf where there's the humanists or the humanities majors who never see science, the science majors who maybe don't know how to bring the humanities in? And I think the answer is probably Jesuit education, but without just giving you guys a total setup. Margaret, what's your take on that?
Well, I guess I would say a couple of things. I think before I get to that, I do want to say one thing about the technology thing. I think that one of the things we might think about, I tend to think locally, right? So one of the things I think we might think about is what are the opportunities we can provide within the context of our institutions, right? For our students to think about those questions, right? How do we, and also in some sense, right? How do we give them technology retreats, right? From technology, right? How do we give them spaces, right? To come to understand better how technology may be structuring their lives, right? Because I think that if we don't provide some context for that, there's little hope, right? of kind of, I don't think there's ever going to be any oversight committee, right? It's just not going to happen, right? So the question is, can we create opportunities where they come to desire a space away from some of this stuff, right? Even if they can't escape it completely, which we never will, right? But they desire that space, right? How do we give them that kind of a desire? With respect to your question about sort of the science student, I will tell you a personal story. So I have 3 children, and I have a PhD in math. My husband has a PhD in math. And between my 3 children, all of whom have graduated from college, 1 math and science course in college. Okay, so and my husband says no one wants to go into the family business, right? And so it's but I do think there's a way in which I actually think that we're not effectively engaging all of our students, right, in what I called the wonder, right? But I think the questions, right? The fundamental questions. And unfortunately, when they come to us, at least again, based on personal experience, right, they already have set in their head that this is what science is and this is what it isn't, right? And so I think there's a lot of uneducating that has to be done, right, about what this is, right, and why it's not for an elite group of nerds, right, that it is something that we can actually all engage in. And I think a lot of us have courses, like Nancy talked about, that Loyola has, right, that try to give them this level of literacy, but also I think try to engage them in the idea that there are really interesting kinds of questions, right, that don't have to be buried under layers and layers and layers and layers of content first, right? And that's the way I think you try to kind of bring them into the conversation, right? Is that I always think you got to start with the questions, right? they care about climate change, right? Right. So let's start with the big questions around climate change, right? And then work our way to inviting them into that conversation.
Yeah, thank you. Aaron, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I want to pick up on what Margaret was saying about those broadening of experiences. So I think even as a faculty member, I think my default is, how do I put things in a syllabus, load them onto PowerPoint decks, and and there's my class. But we've seen such an enrichment in the ways that we can offer students on-ramps to scientific experiences, especially, right? So through summer research experiences, through some universities, we unfortunately don't, but some universities have like January terms, short courses, internships. All of these can offer different but equally rich exposure to STEM. And I think we could do a better job of offering different on-ramps for students to those kinds of experiences. And the other thing I was thinking about, as one of my panelists here had mentioned, universities being agents of social change, that extends also beyond our campus borders. So the ways in which we partner with our local high schools, our local elementary schools, our local primary schools, because that educational gap that we see, that you had mentioned, Chris, right? That begins long before students show up on our campus, and there are amazing opportunities for service learning, for universities that have graduate programs in education, to make those really rich partnerships.
Thank you, Aaron. I am struck. I want to come back to something Chris said before, because you're right. Universities are agents of social change, and so we need to reach out beyond the edge of the university. Not everybody in the sciences sees it that way. And so I'm curious if you all can talk a little bit, assuming you agree with me that we need to be agents of social change, we need to use science to affect the common good. how do you communicate that to an agency like NIH or NSF, who, yes, there's external impact and things like that we have to talk about, but values are not necessarily articulated in quite the same way there. So maybe if you could all just give me your take on how you talk to the larger science world about these ideas.
I had an experience many years ago. I was a program officer for 2 years at the National Science Foundation for their ecology studies program, and people talked a lot about honesty in science, integrity of science. I know this guy cheats, I'm not going to fund his proposal. That kind of stuff was the conversation at the NSF, and that was a while back, but I was really excited by that. I thought, oh, this is good, and the fact that they have rotators, just like at the NIH, it means you can't really kind of, well, it works against setting up sort of a good old boy system where the same people get funded time after time after time. You get a mix, new people coming in. So I believe in science. Christina, I know that you're saying that there are bad guys out there, but I think there are probably a lot more checks and balances in universities that are doing basic science than in big pharma or big ag or any of the big industries that are doing their own research and development. That is unbridled, not peer reviewed. They get money from their own companies. That's the kind of science that worries me more than the kind of science that we're doing at universities. But yeah, I don't know. That was just my experience at the NSF, and I do think that there is a problem that you've identified. I just haven't had it. It's never been a block for me.
I would say it's one of the things you can also act through your professional organization. So I've been on the Hill with the American Institute of Medical and Biological Engineering. So it's taking the time to go up there and getting into offices of our Congress representatives and having conversations. Because I'm going to tell you, everybody else is up on that Hill lobbying. So if we as scientists and engineers don't take the time to do it, we can't expect others to do it. And it's just, and maybe AJCU has an advocate group, not a lobbying group. I'm very careful about that because of tax and legal sort of things, but AJCU maybe needs a group of scientists and engineers to be up on that Hill as well, just like a lot of other organizations are, to talk about this stuff. And Nancy is right about what goes on at companies. I'll just give you an example. Every year, we have some of our senior design projects are sponsored by NIH money, so our students have to go through a integrity and sort of science, a set of workshops sort of thing that we run on our campus. And I'm always asked to meet with the seniors at one point to talk, as I'm working on senior design projects, about ethics and engineering and science, that kind of stuff. And it's not unusual for me to have a room of, let's say, 30 students. And I'll talk to them about, I'll give them examples of things from the medical device industry where there's been a lot of conflict, everything from the surgeon to the medical device company to the reporter who's trying to get, the next journalism award, and everybody in what they're failing to report is what I would say. But I always ask the students, because 80-90% of our students do co-op and internships at companies, and many of them are the big medical and pharma companies. And I'll ask them to write on a piece of paper without any names or identifying a particular company, if they've ever write about something they've experienced in terms of ethical conduct or something in their company. And I'll tell you, 28 out of 30 will write something that really is true. My supervisor asked me to make up data. My supervisor asked me to sign thing about tests we never did. Blah, blah, blah. So these are major companies, I'm going to tell you, that everybody buys their products in this country. And then I meet with the Industrial Advisory Board at the end of the year, several of them, and I show them these things and their mouths drop. And I say, yes, these are your companies that these students are at. You might want to start taking a look at what's happening. So I think these are some of the things that we actually have to bring up and confront and bring it out there, so that people, as you said, Nancy, it can be a Wild West out there in a lot of ways.
Margaret, Erin, anything to add? I've got another question. So this is from our Q&A. And by the way, remember, if you have a question, please go ahead and put it in the Q&A. I'm going to kind of paraphrase. And this is for anybody who'd like to answer it. So a lot of us, there's a resistance to talk about these sort of larger justice and ethics issues, maybe because we haven't had the training or we don't feel comfortable discussing them in the classroom. Whereas in the humanities, maybe faculty have had a little bit more background or are a little more well-versed or a little more comfortable talking about these kinds of issues. So what is your advice for a novice instructor who wants to bring these things into the classroom, wants to talk more about ethics and justice, but doesn't feel like that's in their wheelhouse? How can they get started?
A question like that actually came up at one of our general faculty meetings a couple weeks ago. One of my colleagues in the humanities had said, for my colleagues in the sciences who don't know anything about justice, where can they go and find where can they go and find out more about justice? And I was anyway. So actually, I would point myself to the wonderful resources that we have at our peer Jesuit institutions. I mean, there are centers and institutes and just a wealth of information at our peer institutions. I can say Fairfield, for example, in our core, we have what are called signature elements. One of those is a social justice signature element. So classes can adopt the course content to fit the learning outcomes of our social justice signature element. And there are great resources on our Magis Core website. So I encourage people to check those out. And I always find people at other institutions and probably at your own institution are just delighted that you're interested, right? That you want to find out more, and they're generally happy to respond. Maybe the week you hit them up, they're busy with grading, but generally they'll get back to you, and they're very happy to answer your questions.
I would agree with what Aaron said. I would also say that I think so we're so used to having to be the expert at everything that is in our classroom, right? And that's our safety zone. Believe me, I love that safety zone, right? But I don't think you have to be the expert, right? I think you have to be willing to put the question on the table, right? And even say, I don't actually know the answer to this, right? But I think it's important for us to think about it, right? And then to Aaron's point, right, there are resources you can bring in, right? There are probably colleagues on campus or off campus who could come in if you wanted to have somebody lead the discussion around that question. And there's something pretty powerful about you being a learner along with your students, right? As you're trying to do this. So I think we have to let go of the notion that we have to be expert on everything and put some of our own questions and concerns on the table, right? It's because our students have a lot of questions and concerns, right? And I think if we don't put them on the table, they may think either that they're not important questions, which of course we all think that they are, right? Or that they're questions that should not be asked, and we all think they should be, right? So I would say let's not try to always be the expert.
I think Margaret hits it well. I think best thing we can do is role model for our students. So put the question on the table. And as you said, it's the same thing with issues like diversity, equity, and inclusion. Some of those things where, again, oftentimes the engineering faculty think I don't have to deal with that. I'm, busy doing my science engineering, but yet we've held workshops in our college with people internal from our university. We have staff in Center of Teaching and Learning. We have staff from different offices on campus. We bring them in and we bring them into all college meetings or run workshops. And we bring people, as Aaron said, from other universities to come in and just give people some examples of how to have a conversation in the classroom. What are resources you can draw on? I think it helps us all because it can be very uncomfortable. And but again, a learning opportunity for us as faculty and students to work together in dealing with challenging questions.
Thanks. So speaking of things that are sometimes hard for scientists to bring into the classroom that I want to get your take on, we have a question about integrating Jesuit and Catholic ideals, right? It's easy for us to talk about wonder, I think, and I agree with that, right? And maybe harder for us to directly integrate some of the Ignatian tradition and some of the Jesuit language. So maybe can you talk a little bit about how you've attacked that, or how you've figured out how to bring those ideas in to a chemistry class or an ecology class where it might not make obvious sense?
In my experience, I am a classically trained biologist and went to public schools and never even had a philosophy class. And so I'm pathetically, underqualified for any of this stuff. And I am ashamed that I never had philosophy in my undergrad. I don't know how I got away with it because it wasn't required. And I was more interested in being on the gymnastics team and taking ceramics as my electives. I was, 18 or whatever. But the point being, I rely pretty heavily on our philosophy faculty and our theology faculty because they are, first of all, we have ethicists who are trained, and it's a total discipline. I mean, these people get PhDs in ethics. It's not just something that you feel like, oh, this is good or this is bad, and therefore I'm an ethical person because I know how to. You don't know how to make those. You can't make those decisions about. Think about Gaza and Israel right now. Who's the good guy? Who's the bad guy? I mean, it's very complex and there's lots of history. Those things need to really be addressed by somebody who has the training. So I like to bring them into my classrooms to address these issues so the students really get more of a foundation than just somebody's gut feeling about what's right and what's wrong, or who's the good guy, who's the bad guy. I don't know if that was actually what the question was, but I'm kind of playing off what my other three colleagues were talking about, not always needing to be the expert, but you can be the lead learner. And you can, model to students that I don't know all this stuff, but I want to know it because it's very important and it's important to my science. And so we're bringing in, these conversations.
I think that's critically important, Nancy. And I think you can even do that in the sciences, right? It's fine to say you don't know. And I think modeling, I sometimes call it being productively lost, where you don't know what you don't know, but you know how to find it out, right? And I think teaching students that mindset is super important, that you don't have the answers, but you can find them.
I think we're also very privileged that we work at universities where we can talk about God and love and all these sort of things that maybe we couldn't do if we were at a state university. So I like to take advantage of it, that we have that opportunity, and recognizing that there are students of many different faiths in the classroom, and including students who are probably atheists, but the fact that we can talk about it. And I would say that we often resort to the Ignatian piece often in that language, because I think it tends to resonate better amongst different types of faiths where students are at the time. So I would just say we tend to draw on that. But it starts with leadership at the top. I'm very comfortable talking about love and God in an all college meeting. And I think that because I'm willing to be vulnerable, it opens up other people in the college to do the same and to have those same conversations. So I think a lot of it is in that leadership piece, for students, faculty, and staff. If we're willing to do it, then oftentimes it just is an invitation for others to speak in that same light.
Margaret, is that your experience? You're a mathematician at a liberal arts university. How have you kind of navigated that?
Yeah, I don't think so. So let me just say that I think it's a real question, right? I mean, I don't think it's easy to just throw God into your advanced geometry class, right? I mean, it's not a natural segue, right? There's not a natural segue. But I think that the thing I would emphasize, right, is that from my perspective, it is about sort of opening a space, right? Right, where, to tell you the truth, I trust on God. I trust God to be there when God needs to be there, right? I have complete faith in God being where God needs to be, right? And so I think that what you're doing is opening that space, right? You're opening that space for somebody to say, there's something more here, right? There's something more than what I see, right? There's something more in the world, right, than what I can enumerate, right? There's something more in the world than what I can than what I can actually touch. And so once you do that, right, I think you've opened a space where, again, we're not sitting there alone, right? I mean, we thank the Lord we're at Jesuit institutions where all of our students can avoid the philosophy course, generally speaking. They're going to take the philosophy course. They're going to take the theology course. They're going to be taking humanities courses, right? And what you're doing, I think, is kind of creating an opening for them to pull in, right, some of this other stuff. The other thing I would say is I always tried to be open to the question, right? So I tried to be open to the possibility that a student would come to me and say, here's what I thought of when I saw this, right? And be willing, again, to engage in that conversation as a fellow traveler through this journey.
Thanks. Okay, we've got it. I'm going to do one more question out of the chat here because it's about AI. And so, and I agree with the question, which is that now we're sort of presented with this question of what does it really mean to be human? And catch me offline for a 2-hour debate about the Turing test and ChatGPT and all that stuff, or come to my class afterwards. But so what do Jesuit universities have to offer with this question here? How can we engage with this question from a scientific perspective of what is human and what should we really be focusing on, again, in this world where technology is going to do more stuff for us, and as Nancy said, maybe push us into some things we don't really want to be spending our time on. But what's unique about us? What's unique about us being human? Or how do we figure that out? Maybe that's a better question.
Yeah, Chris, I'd love to. I mean, yeah, I think it's tough, right? And I think we're actually trying to do the science to figure that out. What makes humans different from the AI or the robot or whatever it might be? All I know is they talk about how AI can't yet do stand-up comedy, so it's interesting take on that. But just in your work, I'd love to hear some of your thoughts a little bit even on that in this whole dialogue of what it means to be human in a world where we're really trying really hard to create artificial humans.
I mean, for me, and I'm going to come back to one other thing that has come up, which is like what happens as a result of all this, right? So more and more things are becoming automated, which is great, maybe, right? It could lead to a world where we all work less, and the gains from that are all spread widely. That would be wonderful and utopian. Or it could lead to a world where we have massive unemployment and we have the 0.01% are billionaires and the rest of us are kind of scrambling and just watching a lot of TV. To me, again, to come back to Pope Francis' quote, technology is not neutral. And so we need to decide for ourselves what kind of world we want to live in and educate our students to craft that world, right? It's a decision that we make every day and that we lean into, or that our students are going to make. Because, I don't know about you guys, I'm old and thinking about retiring, but I know that the students we're educating today are going to be the ones who shape that world. And I would like them to shape the utopian world. So I feel like that's the dialogue we need to keep having.
Chris, I really appreciate that you brought up what I think is the best line in that quote from Pope Francis, which is, what is the kind of world that we're trying to create, that we're trying to live in, and what's that vision, that imagination that we have for the future. And in thinking about AI, I wonder, AI. You understand this much better than I, but my limited understanding is that it's this collection, it's this large language model, this collection of others' experiences. One might think about it that way, but what I think has yet to be captured is one person's experience. It's kind of like when they started mapping the human genome, right? And it was at first a composite of all these snippets of different people's DNA, and then eventually they mapped a single person's genome. But when we think about that element of experience in Ignatian pedagogy, the reason it's important that it's one person's experience is because then, we use that process of discernment, which I think is one of the ingredients in Ignatian's special sauce, right? Which we decide, is this moving me closer towards the world that I want to be, or is it moving me further away from the world as I want it to be? And so that's, I think, a critically human component, the fact that it's our experiences and it's moving it towards that prophetic vision of the future or away from it.
I love that. I think you're right on that. It's all about human experience and what we do together. We are coming to the end of our time, unfortunately. I would love to stay for another hour, but I know we all have things to do. But I want to give everybody a little bit of a chance to kind of wrap up and add any closing thoughts. And so maybe Margaret, I will start with you.
I want to thank Aaron for his thought just now. I think that is a really wonderful way for us to be thinking about kind of how we move forward here, right? As we think about, what are the experiences, right? What are the kinds of experiences that we hope for our students, right? Even as we accompany them, right, in the creation of a hope-filled future, right? And so I think that the thinking about, right, the experiences we provide, the ways in which we engage them in STEM and STEM questions, and the questions that are generated perhaps by STEM, I think is a really interesting place to be.
Thank you. Chris, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would just say, first of all, thank you for giving me the opportunity in this amazing panel. It's just, I always learn so much from these sort of dialogues and feel like it makes me a better person. Also makes me much better in what I do in the classroom and as a leader in a university. And I just think, a few of us were joking a little bit about core curriculums at our universities, and it's like moving a huge mountain trying to make changes. But I think two things that I heard today that could really frame the dialogue of any discussion about core curriculum, and that is, what does it mean to be human, and what is the world we want to create? I mean, isn't that what we're really about, as educating our students as going to be individual members, as members of a whole group or community or team? Those really are the two things I think that we're getting through with our education. All of our disciplines are looking at it through different lenses and can question it through different lenses. So really great to be part of this conversation. So thank you.
Thank you. Aaron, would you like to add any closing comments?
Yeah, I'm just so grateful to have been here today with these wonderful colleagues, and I'm really left with this idea of the ways in which STEM can inoculate us against some of specifically, Margaret, it was the word that you used, wonder, the wonder of STEM that can inoculate us against some of those pressures that I think Chris and Nancy, you brought up so eloquently, the funding and the publication pressures. And so how can we try to pass that on? I'm going to try to think about that more carefully to the students that I work with. So thanks for that insight.
Thank you. Nancy, I'll let you have the last word here.
Well, I'll be brief. I kind of want to echo what Christina said, because I feel as though, I know you, Chris Brooks, and Margaret, I know your work as provost, but the others are new to me. And just hearing what you do and how you think and how you approach your work, it inspires me, and it makes me feel even more grateful for being a part of a network of institutions that I really believe in and I think does good work. And we're not perfect and we're full of flaws, but I think that we rise above a lot of the clutter and the stuff that brings us all down and brings our students down. And I think I think hope is a big driver, and that's an important kind of Ignatian characteristic as well.
Totally agree. I think hope is the place to land on. As we said at the beginning, we have a complicated world that we live in, full of terrible things and great things all at once. And we're really on this knife edge about which way things could go. It's hard to have hope sometimes, but when I spend time with our students, I do. And when I spend time with amazing panelists like this, I have hope that our voice, which is a voice about values and about making the world a better place, can maybe have some influence in this complicated world, and that we can push the STEM disciplines in the right direction. So I just want to take a moment to thank Conversations for hosting this, and the wonderful Jim McCartan behind the scenes for all his legwork, and to everybody who took the time to be a part of this and listen in. I really appreciate you taking your lunch or your afternoon or whatever it was to spend a little time with us. And thanks to my fellow panelists as well. This has really been a real pleasure. And so I want to just wish everybody to have a great afternoon, and peace be with you.